The Boeing 737 cruised at 37,000 feet when Captain Mitchell's voice crackled through the intercom with an edge that made seasoned travelers look up from their magazines. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a situation that requires immediate assistance. If there are any military pilots aboard this aircraft, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately." In Seat 8A, Juniper Ghost Thorne didn't stir. Her weathered leather jacket was pulled tight around her shoulders, aviator sunglasses still perched on her nose despite the cabin's dim lighting. To the businessman beside her, she looked like any other exhausted passenger trying to catch sleep on the red-eye from Seattle to Chicago. He had no idea that the woman slumped against the window had logged over 3,000 combat hours in an FA-18 Super Hornet, or that her call sign came from her ability to appear and disappear from enemy radar like smoke in the wind. The flight attendant, Maria Santos, walked the aisle with practiced urgency, her eyes scanning faces for any sign of military bearing. She passed 8A twice, dismissing the sleeping woman in civilian clothes. The passengers began murmuring. Situation was never a word you wanted to hear at altitude. A few rows back, a retired Air Force colonel raised his hand, but his flying days were decades behind him. The cockpit needed someone current, someone who understood modern avionics and emergency procedures. What they didn't know was that Ghost had been awake since the captain's first radio call to air traffic control 20 minutes earlier. Her trained ear had caught the subtle tension in his voice, the careful way he'd requested priority routing, the slight deviation in their flight path. Something was very wrong with United Flight 447. The aircraft shuddered slightly, not turbulence, but the kind of vibration that came from systems fighting each other. Ghost's eyes opened behind her sunglasses, her body remaining perfectly still. Through the small window, she could see the wing's navigation lights flickering irregularly. Bad sign. Very bad sign. Captain Mitchell's voice returned, more strained now. "I repeat, we need any qualified military pilots to make themselves known to the crew immediately. This is not a drill." The businessman next to Ghost finally looked nervous, loosening his tie. Across the aisle, a mother pulled her children closer. The retired colonel was making his way forward, but Ghost could see the uncertainty in his movements. This wasn't his generation of aircraft, and they all knew it. She could continue pretending to sleep. Let someone else handle whatever crisis was unfolding in the cockpit. After 15 years of being dismissed, underestimated, and overlooked, part of her wanted to remain invisible. But 37,000 feet was no place for wounded pride, and Ghost had never been one to let civilians pay for military failures. The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time. Maria Santos was approaching 8A for the third time when Ghost finally moved. She removed her sunglasses with deliberate precision, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds. When she pressed the call button, it wasn't with the frantic urgency of a panicked passenger, but with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to life-or-death decisions. "Ma'am," Maria leaned down, relief evident in her voice at finally getting a response from this section. Ghost's voice was steady, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded respect in cockpits from Kandahar to Kuwait. "Tell your captain that Major Juniper Thorne, United States Marine Corps, is aboard this aircraft. I have current certification on commercial avionics and 3,000 hours of combat flight experience." Maria's eyes widened. She keyed her radio immediately. "Captain Mitchell, we have a qualified pilot in 8A Major Thorne, Marine Corps." The response came back instantly, crackling with desperate hope. "Get her up here, now." As Ghost unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, the businessman beside her finally understood why her posture had seemed so different, why even in sleep she'd held herself with an indefinable alertness. The woman who had looked like just another tired traveler was transforming before his eyes into something else entirely, something dangerous and capable and absolutely essential. She moved toward the cockpit with the measured stride of someone walking into battle, her civilian jacket falling open to reveal the faded outline of wings pinned over her heart years ago. The other passengers watched her pass, sensing without understanding that their lives had just shifted into very different hands. The cockpit door opened before she reached it, Captain Mitchell's face pale with stress and gratitude in equal measure. What he saw approaching wasn't what he'd expected. Not the broad-shouldered male pilot his unconscious bias had pictured, but a woman who moved like coiled steel and looked at him with eyes that had seen the edge of the world and come back intact. "Major Thorne," he said, stepping aside to let her enter the cramped cockpit space. "Thank God you're aboard." Ghost took in the scene with a single sweeping glance that missed nothing: the flashing warning lights, the erratic instrument readings, the way First Officer Hendricks gripped his controls like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Her trained eye immediately identified the primary problem: complete hydraulic failure in 2 of the 3 independent systems. They were flying on backup power and prayer, with limited control authority and no margin for error. "Talk to me," she said, settling into the jump seat behind the pilots with the ease of someone who belonged in cockpits. Her voice carried an immediate calming effect, not because it was soft, but because it was utterly certain. Captain Mitchell's words came in a rush. "Lost primary and secondary hydraulics over Nebraska. We're down to manual reversion on most flight controls. Landing gear is questionable. Flaps are locked in their current position, and we're burning fuel faster than normal because we can't optimize our flight profile." Ghost nodded, her hands already moving across the unfamiliar but fundamentally similar instrument panel. Every commercial airliner was different, but the physics of flight remained constant, and crisis management was crisis management, whether you were dodging surface-to-air missiles or nursing a crippled passenger jet toward an emergency landing. "What's your fuel situation?" she asked, nodding the readings herself but wanting to hear their assessment. 43 minutes at current consumption," Hendricks replied, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Chicago O'Hare is 38 minutes out, but with our limited control authority." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all understood that landing a hydraulically compromised aircraft required precision they might not possess and luck they couldn't guarantee. Ghost had seen good pilots die in similar situations, their skill insufficient to overcome the ruthless mathematics of mechanical failure. But she'd also seen impossible saves, aircraft brought home through a combination of training, instinct, and the kind of stubborn refusal to accept defeat that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. The question wasn't whether this was possible. The question was whether they were good enough to make it possible. "Chicago Tower, United 447 Heavy." Captain Mitchell keyed his radio, his voice professionally calm despite the crisis. "Declaring emergency. We have major hydraulic failure and are requesting immediate clearance for approach and landing. We'll need emergency equipment standing by." The response crackled back with reassuring efficiency. "United 447 Heavy, Chicago Tower. Emergency equipment is being dispatched. You're cleared direct to O'Hare, descent at your discretion. Winds currently 270 at 15 knots, gusting to 22. Runway 22 left is being prepared for your arrival." Ghost was already calculating approach angles and emergency procedures, her mind shifting into the hyper-aware state that had kept her alive through 100 combat missions. The runway length was adequate, the winds manageable, but with compromised flight controls, their margin for error would be measured in inches rather than feet. She looked at Captain Mitchell, seeing past his commercial airline training to the fundamental pilot underneath. Good hands, steady nerves, but this was beyond his experience. First Officer Hendricks was younger, less seasoned, and already showing signs of stress that could become panic if things got worse. "Captain," Ghost said quietly, I need you to know that I've brought aircraft home in worse condition than this. But I also need you to understand that the next 38 minutes are going to test every skill you've ever learned and some you haven't. Can you handle that?" Mitchell met her gaze and saw something there that steadied him, not false confidence, but the real thing, earned through trials he could barely imagine. "Yes, ma'am. Whatever you need." "Good. First thing we need to do is redistribute our remaining hydraulic fluid to optimize what control authority we have left. Then we're going to practice our approach profile at altitude before we commit to landing. One chance is all we get, and we're going to make it count." Her hands moved across the controls with growing familiarity as she spoke, adapting her hard-won knowledge to this unfamiliar aircraft. Outside the cockpit windows, the lights of the Midwest spread below them like a circuit board, beautiful and indifferent to the drama playing out 7 miles above. In the passenger cabin, Maria Santos was briefing the other flight attendants on emergency procedures while trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring. The passengers sensed the gravity of their situation without fully understanding it, their conversations dropping to whispers as they watched the crew move with purposeful urgency. The businessman in seat 8B kept glancing at the empty seat beside him, finally understanding that the unremarkable woman who'd been sleeping there might be the only thing standing between a routine flight and a catastrophic ending. He found himself wondering who she was, what she'd done, what kind of experience could make someone so calm in the face of crisis. Ghost's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Major Thorne speaking from the cockpit. I want you to know that we're dealing with a mechanical situation that requires emergency procedures. Your flight crew is following proper protocols, and emergency equipment will be standing by when we land in Chicago. Please listen carefully to your flight attendants and follow their instructions exactly." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never seen a crew more professional or better prepared than the one on this aircraft. We're going to get through this together." The passengers found themselves oddly reassured by her voice, not because she promised them everything would be fine, but because she spoke to them like adults who deserved the truth. There was something in her tone that suggested she'd been in darker places than this and found her way home. In the cockpit, Ghost was working through emergency checklists with methodical precision, her training overriding any tendency toward haste or panic. Every procedure had to be executed perfectly because there would be no opportunity for corrections. She thought briefly of her squadron commander's favorite saying, "Perfect practice makes perfect performance." Tonight, nothing less than perfect would suffice. Chicago approach, United 447 Heavy. Beginning our descent and requesting vectors for the ILS approach to runway 22 left. United 447 Heavy, Chicago approach. Turn right heading 090, descend and maintain 4000. You're number 1 for the approach, all other traffic is being held clear. The city lights grew brighter as they descended, each 1,000 feet bringing them closer to safety or disaster. Ghost could feel the aircraft's reluctance to respond to control inputs, the way it wanted to wallow and drift despite their best efforts. Flying it was like trying to steer a shopping cart with a broken wheel possible, but requiring constant correction and attention. "Hydraulic pressure in System 3 is fluctuating," Hendricks reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Still within acceptable parameters, but barely." Ghost nodded, unsurprised. System failures rarely occurred in isolation. They cascaded, each problem creating stress that led to additional problems. The key was managing the cascade, controlling it before it became an avalanche that overwhelmed their ability to cope. She reached for the radio. "Chicago Tower, United 447 Heavy. Be advised we may need the full length of runway 22 left. Our rollout distance is going to be significantly longer than normal." United 447 Heavy understood. Runway 22 left is 11,000 feet. All emergency equipment is in position. Winds 270 at 18 knots, gusting to 25. Altimeter 2992. 18 minutes to touchdown. Ghost felt the familiar calm that settled over her in crisis situations, the hyper-aware state where time seemed to slow and every detail became crystal clear. This was where all her training crystallized into instinct, where years of preparation justified themselves in minutes of execution. She thought of her father, a crop duster who taught her to fly in a beaten Cessna over Iowa cornfields. He'd always said that flying was 10% knowledge, 20% skill, and 70% attitude. Tonight, she'd find out if he was right. The aircraft bucked slightly as they passed through 4,000 feet, a reminder that their damaged systems were holding together through engineering tolerance rather than robust health. Ghost made a minute adjustment to their descent rate, feeling the aircraft's response through her hands and translating its mechanical distress into human understanding. "Looking good, people," she said quietly. "We're going to make this work." Captain Mitchell found himself believing her, though he couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was the way she'd settled into the cockpit like she belonged there, or the complete absence of doubt in her voice. Whatever the reason, his own confidence was growing with every minute she remained in command of the situation. Behind them, 147 passengers and 5 crew members trusted their lives to her judgment, most of them unaware that the woman guiding them home had been sleeping in Seat 8A just an hour earlier. They didn't know about her call sign, or why she'd earned it, or the classified missions that had taught her to find calm in the heart of chaos. They would learn, though. Before this night was over, everyone aboard United Flight 447 would understand exactly who had been sleeping in 8A, and why the captain's desperate question had been the most fortunate words ever spoken at 37,000 feet. The approach lights of runway 22 left appeared in the distance, a string of pearls leading toward salvation or catastrophe. Ghost keyed the radio one final time before beginning their approach. Tower, United 447 Heavy, is established on the localizer, beginning our approach. We'll be with you in about 8 minutes. 8 minutes to prove that sometimes the most important passenger on an aircraft is the one nobody notices until everything goes wrong. 8 minutes to show that competence comes in forms that don't always match expectations. 8 minutes to demonstrate why the United States Marine Corps had been right to pin wings on Juniper Thorne, even when half the squadron thought she didn't belong there. The lights grew brighter as they descended toward their date with destiny. Chicago O'Hare International Airport had seen its share of emergency landings, but nothing quite like United Flight 447's approach that night. Air traffic controllers cleared the skies for miles around, creating a corridor of empty airspace that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of runway 22 left like mechanical honor guards, their red and white lights painting the tarmac in urgent colors. In the cockpit, Ghost had assumed practical command without fanfare or formal declaration. Captain Mitchell remained the pilot in command legally and procedurally, but everyone understood that her hands were now guiding their fate. She'd done this before, not exactly this, but close enough that the differences mattered less than the similarities. "Gear down," she ordered, and Hendricks complied immediately. The landing gear extended with mechanical groans that sounded wrong even to untrained ears, hydraulic systems straining to move components designed for routine operation, not emergency deployment. 3 green lights, Hendricks reported, but his voice carried doubt. "Gear appears down and locked, but I'm not getting normal pressure readings." Ghost had expected this. With compromised hydraulic systems, normal was a relative concept. The gear might be locked or it might collapse on touchdown. They'd know which in about 6 minutes. Chicago Tower, United 447 Heavy, is on final approach, gear down and locked. Request confirmation that emergency equipment is standing by for possible gear collapse. United 447 Heavy, affirmative. Emergency equipment is in position and ready. Runway is yours. Winds 270 at 20 knots, gusting to 28. The crosswind was getting stronger, adding another variable to an already complex equation. Ghost made continuous small corrections, fighting the aircraft's tendency to drift and wallow. Every control input required more force than normal, and the aircraft's response came with a delay that demanded anticipation rather than reaction. 1,000 feet above minimums, Captain Mitchell called out, falling naturally into the role of monitoring pilot. Airspeed 140 knots, descent rate 700 feet per minute. The numbers were good, but Ghost could feel the aircraft's reluctance to maintain stable flight. It wanted to drop its nose and accelerate, or pull up and stall, anything except maintain the precise flight path required for landing. She was essentially flying a broken machine, coaxing performance from systems that should have failed completely. 500 feet, Mitchell continued. Airspeed 135, descent rate 600. The runway lights were clearly visible now, a pathway of white and amber leading toward the threshold. Ghost could see the emergency vehicles, their crews standing ready to respond to whatever happened in the next 3 minutes. Some of them were probably betting on disaster. Hydraulic failures were notorious for creating spectacular crashes. She thought of her squadron mates back at Miramar, pilots who'd initially resented her presence and questioned her capabilities. They'd nicknamed her Ghost not out of respect, but because they claimed she could disappear from formations without being noticed, their polite way of saying she didn't belong. It had taken 2 years and a mission over Syria to change their minds. 200 feet, Mitchell called. Looking good, airspeed 130. The aircraft crossed the threshold with Ghost making continuous control corrections, her hands moving across the yoke and rudder pedals with fluid precision. This was the moment of truth. Either their damaged systems would hold together for landing, or they'd discover just how catastrophic hydraulic failure could be. 50 feet, 40, 30. The main wheels touched the runway with a solid thump that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. For a heart-stopping moment, Ghost felt the gear flex and wondered if it would hold. Then the aircraft settled onto the runway with all 3 wheels supporting their weight, and she knew they'd cleared the first hurdle. "Reverse thrust," she ordered, and Captain Mitchell complied immediately. The engines roared as their thrust reversers deployed, adding deceleration to the minimal braking capability their damaged systems provided. The aircraft began to slow, but not quickly enough. "We're not going to stop in time," Hendricks said, his voice tight with renewed panic as he watched their speed and calculated the remaining runway distance. "Yes, we are," Ghost replied calmly, making a decision that would either save them or kill them all. She pulled back on the yoke, using their remaining hydraulic pressure to raise the nose wheel off the runway and increase aerodynamic drag. It was a technique from her military training, dangerous in civilian aircraft, but effective when conventional braking wasn't sufficient. The maneuver worked. Their deceleration rate increased dramatically as the raised nose acted like an air brake, trading their forward momentum for increased drag. The aircraft slowed steadily, finally rolling to a complete stop with less than 1,000 feet of runway remaining. For a moment, the cockpit was silent except for the sound of cooling engines and settling metal. Then Captain Mitchell keyed his radio with a voice that shook slightly with relief and exhaustion. "Chicago Tower, United 447 Heavy, is stopped on runway 22 left. We're going to need emergency evacuation equipment to assist with passenger deplaning." "United 447 Heavy, roger. Emergency equipment is approaching your aircraft now. Outstanding job bringing her home." Ghost sat back in the jump seat, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what they'd just accomplished. 152 people had taken off from Seattle that morning expecting a routine flight to Chicago. Instead, they'd found themselves passengers on what would become one of the most remarkable emergency landings in commercial aviation history. Captain Mitchell turned to face her, his expression mixing professional respect with personal gratitude. "Major Thorne, I don't know how to thank you. Without your expertise, you would have figured it out," Ghost replied, though they both knew this wasn't entirely true. "Good crews find ways to succeed. You just needed someone with experience in bringing damaged aircraft home." As emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft and evacuation procedures began, Ghost remained in the cockpit, completing post-flight checklists with the same methodical precision she'd shown during the crisis. There would be investigations, interviews, and paperwork. The media would want to know about the sleeping passenger who'd saved a planeful of strangers. Her privacy and anonymity were about to become casualties of her competence. But right now, in the quiet aftermath of controlled disaster, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Her father would have been proud. Her squadron mates would finally understand why the Marine Corps had been right to pin wings on her chest despite their doubts. And somewhere in a military personnel file, her record would reflect another successful mission, another impossible save added to a career built on proving that capability came in forms people didn't always expect. The businessman from Seat 8B was among the first passengers to deplane, pausing at the cockpit door to look back at the woman who'd been sleeping beside him just hours earlier. She was still there, still completing checklists, still looking like the most competent person on the aircraft. "Thank you," he said simply. Ghost looked up and nodded, her storm-gray eyes reflecting the calm that came after surviving another day at the edge of disaster. "Just doing my job." But they both knew it had been much more than that. It had been a demonstration of why competence mattered more than appearance, why training trumped assumption, and why the most important passenger on United Flight 447 had been the one nobody noticed until everything went wrong. The evacuation continued as Chicago emergency crews processed the scene, each passenger and crew member carrying with them the memory of voices in the darkness, Captain Mitchell's desperate call for help, and Ghost's steady response from Seat 8A. They'd witnessed something remarkable without fully understanding it, a quiet heroism that asked for no recognition and expected no reward. As Ghost finally gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the aircraft, she could hear the distant sound of news helicopters circling overhead. By morning, the story would be everywhere. "Mystery woman saves Flight 447. They'd get some details wrong, embellish others, and miss the point entirely. The real story wasn't about heroism or drama. It was about preparation meeting opportunity, training overcoming circumstance, and competence speaking louder than skepticism. She paused at the aircraft door, looking back at the cockpit where she'd spent the most important hour of her civilian life. Tomorrow, she'd return to her job as a corporate pilot, flying executives around the country in aircraft that rarely tested her hard-won skills. But tonight, she'd been reminded why she'd learned to fly in the first place, not for glory or recognition, but for moments like this, when everything depended on getting it right the first time. The Chicago night air was cool against her face as she walked across the tarmac toward the terminal, her leather jacket zipped against the wind. Behind her, investigators were already beginning their work, documenting the mechanical failures that had nearly ended in disaster. They'd spend weeks analyzing what had gone wrong and why the landing had succeeded despite overwhelming odds. But Ghost already knew the answer. Sometimes the difference between disaster and salvation came down to who happened to be sleeping in Seat 8A when the captain asked if any military pilots were aboard. Sometimes competence wore an unexpected face and spoke with a quiet voice that had learned authority in places most people would never see. As she disappeared into the terminal crowd, just another tired traveler carrying a small bag and wearing civilian clothes, the only evidence of her extraordinary night was the faint outline of wings still visible on her jacket, a symbol that most people wouldn't recognize, but that meant everything to those who'd earned the right to wear them. United Flight 447 would fly again after extensive repairs and investigation. Captain Mitchell and First Officer Hendricks would continue their careers with a deeper appreciation for emergency procedures and the value of experience in crisis situations. The passengers would tell their story for years, describing the woman who'd appeared from nowhere to guide them safely home. But Ghost herself would fade back into anonymity, carrying her secret knowledge of what had happened that night like a warrior's scar, invisible to casual observation, but permanently etched in memory. She'd proven once again that the most important battles were often fought by people nobody expected, in places nobody noticed, with skills that only mattered when everything else failed. The terminal was nearly empty as she walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing off polished floors. Outside, Chicago slept peacefully, unaware that disaster had been averted 7 miles above their city by a woman who'd been dismissed and underestimated for most of her career, only to demonstrate when it mattered most that competence had no gender, heroism wore many faces, and sometimes the person everyone overlooked was exactly the person everyone needed. Ghost stepped into the night, disappearing into the city like the call sign suggested, leaving behind only questions, gratitude, and the certain knowledge that sometimes the most extraordinary people were the ones who looked most ordinary. Until the moment came when looking ordinary was no longer enough, and being extraordinary was the only thing that mattered. The story of United Flight 447 would become legend in aviation circles, studied by pilots and air traffic controllers, analyzed by safety investigators and emergency responders. But the woman who'd made it possible would remain largely unknown, a ghost in the machine of modern aviation, appearing when needed and vanishing when the crisis passed. Exactly as she preferred it, exactly as it should be. In the morning, newspapers would carry headlines about the mysterious pilot who'd saved 152 lives. Television reporters would interview passengers and crew members, all trying to capture the essence of what had happened in the sky above Illinois. Aviation experts would praise the textbook emergency landing, the flawless crew coordination, the perfect execution under impossible circumstances. But they'd miss the real story, the story of a woman who'd spent her entire career proving that capability came in unexpected packages, that expertise didn't always announce itself with fanfare, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you could do was exactly what you trained for, regardless of whether anyone expected you to be capable of doing it. Ghost Thorne had been sleeping in Seat 8A when Captain Mitchell asked if any military pilots were aboard. By the time she walked away from Chicago O'Hare that night, she'd reminded everyone aboard why that question had been the most fortunate words ever spoken at 37,000 feet, and why the answer had come from the one person nobody had thought to ask. The ghost had materialized when needed, performed the impossible when required, and disappeared back into anonymity when the crisis passed. It was exactly what ghosts were supposed to do, appear at the moment of greatest need, change everything, and vanish without a trace, leaving behind only the certain knowledge that some battles were won by warriors nobody saw coming. United Flight 447 had taken off from Seattle with 152 souls aboard. Thanks to a woman who'd been dismissed, underestimated, and overlooked for most of her career, all 152 souls had walked away from Chicago O'Hare that night. The mathematics of survival had been calculated not by computer or committee, but by hands that had learned precision in places where precision meant life or death, guided by a mind that had been trained to find solutions when no solutions seemed to exist. In aviation, as in war, competence was the ultimate equalizer. Ghost had proven it once again, though few would ever know her name or understand the full measure of what she'd accomplished. She preferred it that way. Ghosts weren't supposed to seek credit or recognition. They were supposed to appear when needed, do what was necessary, and fade back into the shadows until the next time someone sleeping in Seat 8A was exactly what the world needed to survive another impossible night.